Okay, so in this video we're going to be discussing the idea of free energy. And that term can be really confusing because the word free means a lot of different things. In everyday life, it might mean inexpensive, like you don't have to pay any money for it. It might mean free, like it's really easy to get, or it might mean free, like loose and no rules or no boundaries. So really it's probably better not to think of this as free energy, but instead to think of this as available energy as we're talking about it. And that's originally what it was called, and at some point its name got changed to this much more confusing free energy term. Also, to be more technical, this is actually called Gibbs Free Energy, by the guy who first came up with this idea, and it's because of the fact that it's Gibbs Free Energy that the symbol we're going to be using for this most of the time is G, or more specifically, delta G. You probably know from math class that delta means the change in something. So whenever we look at delta G, we're talking about the change in Gibbs free energy of a system. Now, all of this idea of change in free energy is going to be based on what sounds very fancy, which is the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics. Now, the second law of thermodynamics basically says that systems move from higher order to lower order, just naturally. And a great example of that, you can think of a bicyclist. A bicyclist that's riding down a hill, like this one over here, that doesn't require any energy. That happens naturally. In fact, if you leave a bike at the top of a hill, it might accidentally start rolling down without you actually doing anything. On the other hand, if you're going to try to go up a hill, if you're going to try to go the other direction, that takes energy. And so a lot of times when we're talking about even chemical reactions, we'll talk about them as going downhill. When we talk about downhill, we're talking about the direction where things happen naturally. And we'll also talk about things going uphill as the direction of things that happen unnaturally. The more scientific words that we use for these are related to this delta G. And so usually if things are going to happen automatically and naturally, they're releasing energy, which means that delta G, the amount of available energy, you're actually losing available energy. So that'll be less than zero. Anytime delta G is negative, then that's something that is happening naturally because it's releasing energy, like a bicycle going downhill. If delta G is greater than zero, that means you are actually storing energy. And that's like this bicyclist. That requires an input of energy to store that energy, and it doesn't happen naturally. Whereas the release of energy does happen naturally. All right, so let's go ahead and apply this to some biological situations, and that'll help us understand it a little bit better. First of all, let's think about some gases. So right here, I've got these red dots. These red dots represent gases. Individual atoms of gas. Now, if I go ahead and cram all those gases into a corner, like they are right now, then this is what we consider to be a very highly ordered system. And so whenever you have high order, you also have high energy. High G. Now, this is an unstable situation. Having all these gases crammed in the corner like that is not the kind of thing that's going to last. And so what will naturally happen is they'll move to a less ordered configuration. They'll naturally move and spread out like that until they get to this position. This is a situation of low order and are therefore also low energy. Okay? Systems, according to the second law of thermodynamics, naturally move from high order to low order, from high energy to low energy. And that's why, if you think about the change in energy for this, we started out with high energy, and then we had low energy. So the change in energy would be negative. It would be less than zero. And like we said on the other screen, things that have negative change in energy, things that release energy, happen naturally. So these gases would naturally move from a high concentration over here to a low concentration where they're spread out all over the place. All right, now, life seems to violate this rule because all living things are very highly ordered. And you would think that if the second law of thermodynamics is true and all things move from high order to low order, then life couldn't exist. But that's not true. Life can exist. It just has to exist in a delicate balance that we call dynamic homeostasis. Okay? Now, homeostasis means that you have this sort of constant conditions inside of a living thing. So inside of a cell or inside your body always maintains kind of the same temperature. It always maintains the same amounts of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. It maintains the same amounts of vitamins and nutrients like proteins and fats and sugars. And so your cells live in this very constant, balanced world called homeostasis. And if the environment of your cells changes just a little bit, if you get a few degrees warmer or a few degrees colder, that usually signals death because your cells cannot survive outside that very carefully controlled environment that we call homeostasis. Now, how is this maintained? The second law of thermodynamics says that homeostasis is possible, this highly ordered state, but that it shouldn't last. And so living things always have to have an energy input that is greater than the energy output. So you always need to be making sure that you have more energy available, and for you that comes in the source of that you can get that from food, for example. That's the main way that you get energy input. If you were a plant, you'd get that from light. Some organisms can get that from other sorts of chemicals. And that input has to be greater than the output. Basically, output comes from heat that's released off of your body and also from any sort of work that you might do. And if that ever changes, if you ever do more work than you're ready to fuel, that's going to signal a path toward death. It's going to threaten your homeostasis. All right. So when we think about some of the reactions that occur in living things, we can start thinking about the free energy of those reactions. So one of the reactions that's common in living things is photosynthesis. This is where plants take light energy, as shown here, and they absorb that light energy and use it to make this C6H12O6. That's glucose. And glucose is a simple sugar. So when this happens, let's think about this. We're storing light energy. Whenever we store energy, whenever you're giving the plant more available energy, that means delta G, the energy available to the plant, is going to be increasing. It's going to be greater than zero because we're storing energy. Now, the opposite of photosynthesis is what we call cellular respiration. That's where plants and animals and other living things take the sugar, right here, C6H12O6, and they break it down into other smaller molecules and they actually release that energy. So in photosynthesis, you're storing the energy, but in cellular respiration, we're releasing the energy. So in this case, delta G is going to be less than 0. Energy is being released. Okay, and we said that things like this, where you're storing energy, these are what we call endergonic reactions. Just want to make sure I spell that correctly. Endergonic means that you're storing things. Endo means inside, as opposed to exergonic, exo means outside, where you're actually releasing energy. So photosynthesis is a classic endergonic reaction, and cellular respiration is a classic exergonic reaction. Endergonic reactions, like photosynthesis, require sort of an input of energy, light energy in this case, whereas exergonic reactions actually release energy. Another great example is what happens to adenosine triphosphate, more popularly known as ATP. ATP is the primary energy source of your body, and it looks just like this. And the most important part are these 3 little circles right here, which are phosphates. The name ATP stands for adenosine. This right here is an adenosine. Triphosphate. Triphosphate indicates these 3 phosphates. These phosphates store a lot of energy. So whenever your body wants to get energy quickly, what it will do is it will break one of these phosphate bonds and release that phosphate, which also releases that energy. And that creates an adenosine diphosphate. Notice it's only got 2 phosphates, which is also known as ADP. Right? So the conversion of ATP to ADP releases energy. Therefore, since energy is being released, delta G is going to be less than 0, and that makes this an exergonic reaction. You can also, living things also go the other way. They input energy and turn ADP back into ATP in an endergonic reaction. All right, now a lot of times what you'll see graphs of this, graphs of the delta G. And we might think of the transformation from ATP, which has a certain amount of energy up here, to ADP. Now we said that that releases energy, and that's because ATP has a lot more free energy than ADP. So this change from here down to there, that's going to be the delta G. But it doesn't just happen straight. It doesn't just go straight from ATP to ADP. There's actually a little bit of a curve in this graph. So as you're switching from one to the other, it takes some energy, and then the energy is released. So this amount of energy that you have to put in right here to get over this hump, that's called the activation energy. And biological systems have a lot of ways of getting around this, but if you want to release the energy from ATP, it always takes a little bit of energy first in order to get over the hump, as we say, and then that energy can be released. And this is true of all exergonic reactions. All right. We're going to talk some more about how this applies to living things in different situations in a second, but you're going to need to come back for the next video for that.